Hi, this is the University of Indianapolis OTD 551 Research Analysis, and I'm Dr. Brenda Howard, and this is Qualitative Analysis Week 4, Analyzing and Synthesizing Qualitative Data. So let's start by talking about some of the ethical issues that we can encounter. I know we've talked about this a great deal already this semester, but as you are analyzing your data, you have two particular concerns. The first is protecting your participants from harm. So, how are you going to do that? Well, definitely you want to make sure that you are storing your information in a secure place. If it is on paper, of course, you would have it in a locked drawer in a locked office. And if it is electronic, you'd want to have it in a password protected computer in a locked or encrypted file that's password protected in some way. So this is also where you might be collecting your data using pseudonyms. So you'll ask your participants to choose a name or a number that they can use to represent themselves, and you will use those pseudonyms throughout your data analysis. You also want to make sure that you're using informed consent, just like always. So you follow the university protocols for informed consent, making sure that you're stating that it's a research study and that you give the title. And just remind participants that they can cease participation at any time, and those sorts of things. So, you also, in our second type of ethical issue, want to make sure that you are disclosing comprehensive findings. So, this means that when your study is all said and done, that you are providing full information on what you found, full disclosure. So, even if you found things that you don't like, if you don't didn't think you proved your hypothesis in some sorts of research, um, you want to be clear about that. You also, especially in qualitative research, don't want to fabricate your data. So if you can't remember or aren't sure what someone said, you don't just make it up off the top of your head. You've got to go back to your data. You can only report what you have. So in general, you want to stick as closely to the data as you can. Report the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And that is what you want to do when you're reporting your qualitative data. So we have three analysis stages. First, we have to prepare and organize the data, just like we did with quantitative. Then we're going to reduce the data into themes. We're going to code the data, and then we're going to condense the codes down into themes. And then we're going to represent that data in figures and tables, and then we're going to go on and discuss it in our write-up or in our presentation. So here's our data analysis spiral. So this just kind of reminds us of all the steps that we have in the process. So first we collect the data, of course, and hopefully by now in your mini qualitative project, you have done that. You've conducted your interview. Then you have to figure out what you're going to do with that information. How did you create your transcript? Where are you going to save it? Where are you going to store it so that it's safe and in a spot that cannot be accessed by other people? And then you have to organize that. You can go through and clean up your transcript, put in paragraph returns, and you can take out the ums and uhs if that's something that you need to do. Then you're going to spend some time with that data, reading and writing memos and coming up with emergent ideas. What bubbles up as you're reading through it? Then you're going to finalize everything by describing and classifying the codes into themes. So let's talk about these just a little bit more. How are you going to collect your data? Hopefully, again, we've done that by now, so we won't stay there for very long. Let's talk about managing and organizing our data. So remember, with qualitative studies, your data can get quite large. Even with one transcript, you can have multiple pages, even just with a 30-minute interview. Sometimes just the sheer volume of the information that you collect in a qualitative study can be super overwhelming. So making sure that you, especially if you have multiple interviews, that you're organizing and labeling things so that you can find them again and you know where they are. Use spreadsheets or Google Docs to organize how you are, record how you're organizing things so that you can go to find them again. This is where, if you are creating any sort of, tracking system, you need to have what your labels are for things. When you get into creating themes, you're also going to want to track your themes and have those organized as well. So this is all part of just keeping organized and being able to track down where you put things. Okay. decide how you're going to track these things before you even start. Who's going to manage the recordings? Who's going to make sure the transcript is cleaned up? Who's going to enter the transcript into your analyzing software? So these are some of the things that we're actually going to spend some time doing in lab. And last but not least, you want to create an audit trail. So every step along the way, when you are analyzing your qualitative data, you need to make a trail as to what you did. What date did you create the transcript? What date did you clean the transcript? What date did you start coding the transcript? What date did you all come together and compare your codes? So you want to make sure that you're following along in an audit trail. Spreadsheets are handy for this. You can also just use a word table, but that's very important for when you go back and you're writing up your data that you have, exactly when did we do what. Super handy. All right, so the next thing you're going to do once you've got your data all organized is you're going to read it and you're going to create memos. So remember, memoing comes from the grounded theory tradition, but you can actually use it in any qualitative tradition. So you're going to write notes as you go along in the process, and those are just called memos. So say, for example, you're reading through your transcript and you get a great idea that you're like, well, this sounds like our one of our articles from our literature review. Well, I want to go back and look at Smith and Jones and see how that coordinates with what they're saying. That's when you write it down. Make a quick memo as to what's going on. Always stop and note it down when an idea strikes. Okay. What about then reducing that data into themes? So when you are looking at themes, you're first going to just be reading the transcript through several times. You're going to do this individually. And then as you're reading, you're creating your memos as you're going along. And then you start to pull in some of your ideas from your theory and philosophy. Some of those words from your theory and philosophy can be sort of ideas to hang your concepts on as you're going along. So it's like a coat hanger that you can put your concepts on as you go along. Okay. So for example, when I was working with a group to look at moral distress, we had a definition of moral distress that we were using. And when people mentioned concepts that came from that moral distress definition, we could be like, oh, that goes with the moral distress theme. Let's make sure that we code that so that it goes over there. So having those theoretical perspectives can actually help you when it comes to your coding because you've already got words that you can use to help categorize things into those themes. So once you have some memos done, once you've lived with the data for a little bit, you want to start doing some highlighting. So this is where I like to use Deduce. I think it's a really handy computer program. I've also used NVivo in the past, and that's been useful as well. But you can also do the good old-fashioned print it out on paper, grab some highlighters and colored pencils, and just start highlighting. Start highlighting things that go together. Keep your colors if you're doing it on paper with you. In Deduce, you can actually start naming themes and creating a code book right in Deduce, and then highlighting, oh, I feel like this goes with that topic, but it also goes with this other topic, and you can actually code it a couple different ways. You don't have to stick with quote unquote one color. All right. So after this, you're going to have a whole bunch of codes, a lot of which may not agree with what other people in your groups did. So then you're going to sit down and start talking with each other. You're going to think about, well, what are we going to call each code? Maybe you called it this, but I called it that. Well, let's talk together and see if we can figure out what we're going to call it. And this is where you are embedding your sorting strategies. So you've decided what your sorting strategies are, and you've embedded them in your data analysis process. You're going to start aggregating your information into smaller categories of information, and we'll work on doing this in lab. I'll be showing you how to do that. And then you can use quotes to provide evidence for the categories. So you may remember in that very first week with Stephanie Kelly, where she had you organizing things that the person had said into different categories and themes. Now you're going to go back and grab some of those quotes that you thought really illustrated the theme, and you're going to be hanging on to those and putting those in categories as well. Again, a program like Deduce is super useful for keeping this all organized. If you do it on paper, getting out the scissors and starting to cut things up and putting things like in different folders can be useful as well. So in our book, in figure 8.2, there's actually some really useful information on how to describe and classify codes into themes. Again, keeping a code book is super important at this point, because if you can't remember what that thing was called, you can always go back to your code book and then describe what you intended to call it based on what's in your code book. Okay, here are some types of codes. Now, these types of codes can be used for any of our qualitative approaches that we're using. So a priori or pre-existing codes are things that we were expecting to find or things that we were looking for. So for example, in the moral distress study that I did, we were actually asking about moral distress using that definition of moral distress, and we had an a priori or pre-existing code about moral distress. So our hanger that we were hanging things on, we already had that name, that word for that. We knew that we were looking for that as part of our process. In a way, it's admitting to your own assumptions to say, I'm assuming that people during COVID time had moral distress because I sure did. And some of the literature says that existed. So let's ask about that. And that's going to be our a priori code. In vivo codes are codes that are in the exact words of the participants. So you create a code that comes straight from the words that the participants used. So an example of this would be, we actually looked at Kinsella and Bidnowski's 2016 article, and they actually included an in vivo code right in the title, which was, I now have a visual image in my mind, and it is something I will never forget. And so an in vivo code is something that you feel like is best said in the participants' words. It's just so clear when they said it, and it so demonstrates, something that came out of the data. So you just, use their very words for it. Okay. Then you can organize codes according to what is making the most sense. If you feel just absolutely lost, one of the ways that I think is super simple to start organizing your codes is by using the period, exclamation point, question mark method. So period is things you expected to find, things that you were directly asking about. So things that you thought you would see. The exclamation point is things that were unexpected, things that came out that you were not expecting to see. And then the question mark is interesting or unusual, things that you're not sure about that you think may still need to be investigated. So let's talk a little bit about organizing our codes by approach. So for example, in a narrative approach, you're going to be using stories to organize your codes. And now what the titles of your stories is going to be could change according to the data that you did receive. In phenomenology, you're going to be looking at experiences and context. And in processes and actions, interactions are things that you're going to look at for grounded theory. What are some of the processes that came out of that? In ethnography, you're going to be looking for cultural themes. And in a case study, of course, you're going to be looking for detailed description of that case from multiple points of data. So each of these 5 approaches have their own data analysis steps. And so look to your own methodology, use the book to go ahead and take a look at how did they analyze it? What are the processes according to the tradition that you're using that's going to be helpful? So let's look at narrative. So the first thing you're going to want to do in narrative is identify and describe the stories that you are founding and lay out the chronology. You might even create a figure that's a timeline. An important thing that often comes out in narrative are some sorts of epiphanies or eureka moments that the people who are telling the stories have, and that's going to be important to include. And then you also want to describe the context. What is the context of what's going on behind this? You're looking for the stories and their meanings. So that's what you're going to follow in that tradition. In phenomenology, the whole goal is to describe the personal experience or the essence of the phenomenon, the lived experience that the person is going through. So this is where we're going to be looking for some significant statements and grouping them according to meaningful units, what seems to make the most sense, and emerging from those inductive points of data, start clumping them into things that make sense and then developing them into themes. Now, one tradition with phenomenology says you create a textual description. That's a very it's a text. It's exactly what happened. It's just trying to record the phenomenon, what happened. And then the structural description is about how it was experienced. What were the contextual factors behind it? How did the different people that you interviewed experience it differently? What are some of the structural differences there? And then you come back and create a composite to describe this rich, thick description of what happened in the study when you were collecting your data. Now, grounded theory, we already know some of this. We start with open coding, just starting to group things together that make the most sense. Our inductive reasoning again. What are the clumps that are starting to show up? Is there a central phenomenon that starts to emerge? Maybe it's a value, maybe it's a point of view. What's the main thing that is starting to come out of this? That's our axis. And then we start creating axial coding. How do the clumps that we've found so far fit around that central phenomenon or around several central phenomena? Okay. From there, we're going to develop the theory. What's our theory about how this thing is occurring? So now we have this theoretical perspective. We've got our axis, we've got our clumps around that axis, our themes around it. And now maybe we have some things that are left over or didn't quite fit. Um, we may be going into another iterative cycle of data collection, and now we're selective coding. We're going to start aligning what else we found with that central phenomenon and with the axial coding. Then we might be done, or we might create a conditional matrix, which is in the future, how might other events line up with this theory? And what are all the possibilities that could happen? I actually have not seen a study in occupational therapy that uses a conditional matrix. Most of the time it stops with that selective coding, but just, so you know what it is, we're including it here. Ethnography. So this is where we're wanting to describe the context, of course, but also what's the culture? What's the social setting? What are the people? What are the elements of the people that's important? What are the themes and the patterns? And then how do we make sense of all that in how the culture works? So you're looking also in this tradition at transformative information. How might what we learned change things for the future? So think back to let's say, for example, the phenomenological study that we looked at with Nirmal et al. That was looking at um, what does intersectionality of being a woman of color have to do with how people become leaders in the profession of occupational therapy. If they had gone from an ethnography tradition and they had looked at like the culture of creating leaders within occupational therapy within women of color, then they might be looking at how can we change this for the future? How can we create a more I don't know, something that's more intentional about helping women of color become leaders in occupational therapy. So that's how an ethnography might be looking at analyzing the data. What about a case study? So the case study, we remember it might use interviews, but it also uses other points of data. It might be looking at the patient chart, definitely going to be looking at context, what's going on around this particular individual, what are the social context, the physical context, the built environment, what are some of those other things that we've learned about in our theory class that help us to define the context, and how are we describing that within this case study? What are some of the categories that we're using to look at themes or patterns? How are we then directly interpreting this case study? And if we're looking at more than one case, what are the connections between the cases and what are the differences between the cases? So we're looking in general to define the case and all the different aspects that it has so we can learn as much about this particular condition, experience that people are having within this case. So tips and tricks. So the first thing we want to do is make sure we're keeping that audit trail. How are you tracking what you're doing? You want to save memorable quotes as you go. Use your memos. Create notes as you're going along. Create your diagrams and then don't be afraid to delete them and start all over again or revise them as you go. And then create your draft summary statements for any sections or chunks as you see fit. So as you are creating your diagram, maybe you want to describe this chunk and then that chunk as you go along. And actually the Nirmal Al article on intersectionality does a great job of creating a diagram and then creating chunks to go with it. So even if their topic is not similar to yours, you can take a look at how they wrote things up to think about how might you then describe your study in your presentation. Okay, so how do we interpret the data? We're representing the data, we're visualizing the data, we're creating those figures that help to describe our data. We also want to then, as we go into our discussion, challenge our interpretation of the data by looking at other literature. Did people find what you found? Did they find something different than what you found? This is also where you might be obtaining peer feedback. Would your peers look at this in the same way that you did? Maybe somebody who had nothing to do with your study, would they interpret it the same way as you, or do they agree with your interpretation? Things like your APA manual, your information in your textbooks, are also great at showing you how to represent and interpret the data. You might be using flowcharts, concept maps, smart art, bar graphs, pie charts, tables with quotes. Those are just some of the ways that you might interpret and represent and visualize the data that you have. All right, let's talk a little bit about validity. So we said previously in this semester that validity between qualitative and quantitative studies is like comparing apples and oranges. You can't use the same terms to talk about validity. So instead, we talk about it as trustworthiness. Some other terms that we might use are structural corroboration, consensual validation, referential adequacy, and understanding. But usually trustworthiness is the one that you'll see. So how are some of the validation strategies? What do these look like in qualitative data? So we're looking at them from the researcher's lens, the participant's lens, and the reader's or the reviewer's lens. So we're clumping our validation strategies or our trustworthiness strategies according to these three lenses. Let's talk about the researcher's lens. So from the researcher's lens, we're looking at that idea of triangulation. So the researcher is wanting to collect multiple types of data, perhaps having multiple investigators look at the data, having multiple theories as perspective, so multiple angles of ways to examine the data. Another way from the researcher's lens, especially in case analysis, is to have a negative case, a case that does not confirm the other cases that you've collected, something that looks different, what we might have called an outlier in our quantitative data. Okay. Another way that researchers use their lens to prove trustworthiness is to clarify their own researcher bias through reflexivity. So you might remember in the article that we read last week, the Nirmal article, that they engaged in reflexivity and said, here's our point of view. Here's where we're coming from. Here's our experiences with this particular topic. And we're going to try to bracket that and set that aside so that we can then talk about this data from as unbiased a perspective as we're able to. So looking at your own assumptions as a research team, and then considering your reflections as you are moving through the progress is super helpful. So this is, again, where your audit trail can come in. You can go into your audit trail and note down a date and say, on today's date, we reflected on our process and realized that we were making an assumption that we hadn't realized that we had at the beginning. And just making notes of those things as you go on can be super helpful. So again, researcher's lens, triangulation, multiple types of data, multiple investigators, multiple theories, having a negative case analysis, and clarifying your own bias. That's the researcher. What about the participant? How can we have trustworthiness from the participant's lens? Well, this is where we can do member checking, where we actually return to our participants and say, here's what we found as themes. Does it match what you think? Does it fit your experience? Do these themes resonate with you? Do they ring true? And you can get their feedback on that. You can do that through a survey. You can do that through um, a focus group. You can do it through a second interview. Okay. So, another way that you can do it is in ethnography, where you're having prolonged engagement with the participants and you're persistently observing them. So, you're triangulating not just from what they say, but from what you're observing of what's going on and of how you've been engaged with the process all along. And another way is with the whole social justice genre of qualitative research is collaborating with the participants. Let them come up with their own directions, their own ways they want to look at the topic, and their own solutions, their own ways of precipitating change throughout the process. So those are all ways through the participant lens. And probably the most common of that would be the member checking, in some way going back to the participants to say, does this ring true with you? Researcher's lens, participant's lens, reader's lens, or the reviewer's lens. So just like a Google 5-star review, we are looking at how do we get the reader's perspective. So some of this may come about from an external audit. Have a peer review your study who's external to the study and have them look at both the process and the product, the outcome. Would they have come up with the same thing as you? Do they have any suggestions? Do they have any questions? Like, I don't know what this means when you said this. I have no idea what you're talking about. So you can get their opinion on that. Also, a rich, thick description. So that's where, if you remember in the phenomenological tradition, where you're looking at gathering both the textual, which is sort of the state the facts, and the structural, what are the contexts, what are the surrounding factors that are going on with this, and you're compiling this rich description of what's going on. That factor is going to give you that something that from the reader's lens will help them define the study. So even though you can't, actually by creating that rich, thick description, it's coming from the researcher's perspective, you're trying to take the perspective of the reader to come up with that. And then you can also do peer review or debriefing, where you have a colleague or a student play devil's advocate and ask you questions about your study. Okay, so we've talked about trustworthiness, which is our validity from the reader's perspective, the researcher's perspective, and the participant's perspective. Now let's talk a little bit about reliability. How do we know that this is repeatable? Well, one of the ways that we do that is by having multiple coders, if at all possible, and having intercoder agreement. So this would be using that common platform like Deduce, or everybody using the same method to do their coding, of using a code book so that everybody, by the time you are done with the product, is using the same codes, and you're constantly revision, you're constantly talking. Okay, so if a group of researchers on a project get together and they are discussing what are the codes that we're going to use, how are we going to revise what we've got so far, how does what you found fit in with what I found, on the same document, on the same transcript. Okay, that's called intercoder agreement. Your audit trail also solidifies your reliability because you're showing how someone else could reproduce your results if they followed the same steps as you did. All right, this is my reminder to tell all of you to check Chapter 10 because it has some helpful checklists for you to look at when you are going through the process of your research, to make sure that you are following all the steps within the tradition or the approach that you have chosen. And this is where your group will want to discuss, and this is the activity that you can do and think about between now and when we come together on Wednesday. How is your group going to ensure ethical completion of your research? How are you going to manage, organize, and store the transcript that you've created? How are you going to work together to create codes, memos, and themes and reach that agreement and keep a code book and keep an audit trail? You need to do that even for the mini study that we're doing. How are you going to use your chosen approach to guide your analysis? Hint, hint, use the checklist in Chapter 10. Use some validation strategies. So what validation strategies can you use? Choose 2 or 3 that we talked about today. So what were those? Those are that researcher's lens, participant's lens, and reader's lens. And how are you going to ensure reliability of your process? So we'll have some call outs on Wednesday. Thank you for coming along with me on this ride. I hope you enjoy Eclipse Day, which is why this recording is being made. And I'll see you soon. Thank you.